My dad told everyone success was in his blood, until I opened the gift that drained it out. They thought I brought cookies. What I brought were documents that exposed years of lies, stolen money, and a name built on fraud. He told me to stop pretending I was rich. But that night, everyone learned I was the only one who actually was. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The wind off the Pacific hit me the moment I stepped out of the car, carrying that salty chill that always reminded me of the winters I spent here before I left. The Dawson house glowed from the cliff above Del Mar, like it was competing with the stars. Every inch wrapped in gold lights, every window alive with movement and laughter. I could already hear the soft jazz playing inside, the kind Mom loved to play at her perfect Christmas parties. It was supposed to sound warm. It just sounded rehearsed. I adjusted the collar of my black coat, smoothed the creases on my simple dress, and walked toward the entrance, the small silver gift box in my hand catching the porch light. The valet boy looked at me, smiled politely, and opened the door. Heat and the smell of champagne rolled out. For a moment I hesitated, 10 years away, and it still felt like walking into someone else's movie. Inside everything was as I remembered. The house looked like a magazine spread crystal ornaments on the 12-foot tree, a live jazz trio. In the corner, caterers in black and white, weaving through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. My mother, Eleanor, was standing near the staircase, wearing a sequined red gown, and that same glossy smile she'd perfected for social occasions. My father, Thomas, stood by the fireplace, brandy in hand, surrounded by a small crowd of men from the firm. I could hear his booming laugh from across the room. "Best year we've ever had," he said, lifting his glass. "The Dallas expansion's already showing profit. 2025 will be a record breaker." I watched him the way his confidence filled every corner of the room. Dad didn't just run Dawson Realty. He was Dawson Realty. Every success, every deal, every conversation came back to his name, Claire. My mother's voice sliced through the hum of conversation. "Oh, look who decided to show up." Heads turned. For a second, the music and chatter dimmed just enough for me to feel the weight of their attention. I took a slow breath and stepped forward. Ryan was the first to speak. He leaned against the marble bar, whiskey glass in hand, that same smirk he'd worn since high school plastered across his face. "Well, well. My little sister decided to join civilization. Still playing with paints?" His friends laughed. I smiled back, still pretending to know business. The laughter faltered. Ryan's smirk wavered. Mom stepped in tone, sweet but sharp as glass. "Let's not start, dear. It's Christmas." "Claire, you look modest. Still doing that art thing. Still making a living from it," I said, setting my coat over my arm. Dad turned toward me, then eyes scanning from my plain dress to the silver box in my hand. "You came all the way from Seattle for this?" "Yes," I said. "I figured family deserves a visit," he chuckled. "Or maybe you finally realized what real work looks like." There it was. The yearly reminder that I didn't fit his version of success. I let it slide off me. The years had taught me that silence hurt them more than argument. I walked toward the gift table in the center of the room. The surface was covered with designer boxes, Hermes ribbons, Tiffany blues, crisp white, Neiman Marcus tags. My little silver box looked out of place among them. I placed it carefully at the edge. Ryan sauntered over, peering at it, trendy wrapping. "Did you borrow it from one of your creative friends?" I looked at him. "No, I wrapped it myself." He snorted. "Well, at least it looks expensive." I smiled. Funny, isn't it? How looks can fool people. A middle-aged woman nearby laughed awkwardly. "That's the spirit of Christmas. What's inside matters most." "Exactly," I said, meeting Ryan's eyes. "What's inside?" Mom floated closer, whispering in my ear. "Claire, try not to make the guests uncomfortable." "I'm just talking, Mom." Her smile didn't waver, but her voice dropped. "People remember everything said at these parties. Don't embarrass your father." I glanced toward him. Dad was laughing loudly again, his hand on Ryan's shoulder, telling the same story he always told about how his son closed his first deal at 25. I used to think pride sounded like that, loud, public, unshakable. Now I knew it was just noise. I drifted to the edge of the room, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the ocean. Outside, the waves broke softly against the rocks, moonlight turning the water silver. For a brief second, I let the sound drown out the music and chatter. Claire. Dear, you must meet the Johnsons, Mom called. They just moved from Denver, and they're looking for design work. Maybe something in your field. The pause before the last word made me smile. Maybe another time, I said, turning back to the window. The fireworks over Del Mar Beach began then. Tiny bursts of gold and green lighting up the horizon. Reflections rippled across the glass, making the party behind me shimmer like something unreal. My father's laughter, my mother's polished voice, Ryan's bragging. It all blended into one hollow melody. I touched the edge of the gift box, still in my hand, tracing the ribbon with my thumb. Its weight felt heavier than before. Not from what was inside, but from what it would soon reveal. I could almost hear Nancy's voice from years ago, calm and certain. There will come a time when silence won't serve you anymore, Claire. Pick your moment, then speak with truth. I looked back at my family, unaware of the storm sitting quietly at the center of their table. Enjoy the fireworks, I whispered to myself, setting the box down with care among the glittering gifts. No one noticed. Outside, the final flare burst above the Pacific, scattering gold over the water. I stayed by the window, watching until only smoke remained, wondering how much longer the facade inside this house would last before it burned out too. The party was in full swing when I found a quiet corner near the window, far enough from the noise to breathe. From there, I could see the whole room move like a well-rehearsed performance. Laughter rose and fell on cue. People compared stock portfolios and ski plans in Aspen, pretending they actually cared about each other's answers. The scent of rosemary roast and perfume mixed thick in the air. Claire, a soft voice called. It was Lily, my 13-year-old niece, balancing a plate of cookies like a waitress. Her braces glinted when she smiled. You're hiding, maybe I said, sliding the plate away from the edge of the table. Crowds make me nervous. She plopped down beside me. Mom says Grandpa's bragging again, about the new deal in Dallas. Do grown-ups ever talk about anything besides money? I laughed under my breath. Not the ones in this room. She tilted her head, frowning. Why not? I looked across the room. My father was surrounded by men in suits, glass raised, telling a story about his 20% profit margin, as if it were a heroic act. My mother stood nearby, nodding like a politician's wife. Because I said quietly, money is how they make themselves feel safe. If they stop talking about it, they might have to talk about things that scare them. Lily thought about that, then grinned. You're weird, Aunt Claire. Thank you, I said, and she ran off to find more dessert. The laughter across the room carried me somewhere else, back to a winter I'd tried to forget. I was 18, standing in my father's office, hands trembling as I held an acceptance letter from the Rhode Island School of Design. The paper smelled like ink and hope. It's one of the best art programs in the country, I said. They offered a partial scholarship. My father didn't even look up from his desk. You're not going. What, why? Because our family doesn't need another starving artist. You'll study business at UC San Diego. You'll learn how to help the company. It's not what I want. He finally looked up, eyes sharp. It's not about what you want. It's about what this family needs. I remember the silence that followed. My mother stood in the doorway, not saying a word, her face smooth as porcelain. I realized then that no one was going to defend me. 3 days later, I packed my bag and left. I still remember the sound of the train leaving the Seattle station. The windows fogged from my breath, my hands clutching that letter like it was the only proof I had of who I was supposed to be. When my father called me a disappointment, he thought it would break me, but it did the opposite. His disbelief became the fuel that carried me through every late night, every rejection, every year of proving him wrong. The clinking of glasses pulled me back to the present. My father stood at the center of the room, his hand on Ryan's shoulder, telling one of his endless success stories. This one, he said, squeezing Ryan proudly, just landed a 6-figure investment. You should have seen the look on that client's face. The guests laughed. My mother beamed. Our golden boy, she said. I took a sip of champagne that tasted like sugar and steel. Ryan had been handed everything: a condo downtown, a company car, a job at Dad's firm that required nothing more than showing up and knowing the right last name. I watched him throw his arm around our father, the perfect image of success. The same boy who 10 years ago had maxed out Dad's credit card on bottle service and watches. No one remembered that. They only remembered the myth. I thought of the years I spent working 12-hour shifts in a drafty studio in Seattle. My hands cracked from sanding wood, my stomach twisting from instant noodles and fear. No one in this room had ever seen that version of me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The gift exchange started. The air grew thick with polite excitement as guests opened boxes wrapped in silk ribbons, pretending to be surprised. Watches, perfumed designer handbags, gift cards worth more than a month's rent. It was the same every year. I sat back quietly watching the parade of wealth. Then my father looked at me, his voice carrying across the room. "Claire," he said, smiling. "Even you managed to make your gift look fancy this year. Guess you finally learned presentation." A ripple of laughter followed. I felt every eye flick toward me, waiting for me to be the punchline again. I smiled. "I learned from the best dad. You taught me well, how the outside is what people notice first." He blinked, unsure whether to take it as a compliment or not. "That's right," he said finally. "It's all about appearance." Though I added, setting my glass down, the inside tends to matter more. Don't you think? The laughter faded. For a second there was a tiny pause, the kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats. Then my father chuckled, the sound echoing against the marble. "That's my daughter. Always the philosopher." The room relaxed again. The conversation picked back up. I excused myself and walked to the terrace doors. The cold night hit me like a baptism. Below, the Pacific stretched out in black velvet, dotted with faint lights from the fishing boats near Coronado. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the salt air. Through the glass behind me, I could see my family, laughing, toasting, playing their parts. From out here, they looked like strangers trapped inside a snow globe, sparkling but suffocating. The wind tugged at my hair, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere down the beach, a wave crashed hard against the rocks, loud enough to drown the music for just a moment. I whispered to myself, "It's almost time." The words drifted into the night, carried off by the ocean breeze, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the sea and the quiet promise that before this night was over, everything inside that house would finally be real. In 2016, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Seattle that smelled like coffee grounds and paint thinner. The walls were bare. The heater rattled all night, and every dollar I earned seemed to vanish before the end of the week. In the mornings, I poured lattes for tech employees, who made more in a week than I did in a month. At night, I drew designs under the weak glow of a desk lamp that flickered whenever it rained, which in Seattle meant always. I was 23, broke, and stubborn enough to think that hard work alone could change my life. That fall, I rented a booth at a small art fair in Pike Place Market, hoping to sell a few custom sketches of interior spaces, modern homes, lofts, cafes. My table looked amateur next to the polished stands of established designers. By noon, I had sold nothing except a postcard-sized print for $10. That's when she appeared. A woman in her 50s, sharp eyes, gray hair swept into a bun, wearing an expensive scarf that didn't belong anywhere near this part of town. She stopped in front of my booth, studying one of my hand-drawn blueprints. "Who designed this?" she asked. I did. She looked at me for a long second, then back at the drawing. "You see space differently. Most people draw walls. You draw breath." I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it was the first compliment that had ever felt real. She introduced herself as Nancy Holloway, retired investment executive, now an independent consultant for creative startups. We talked for nearly an hour. She asked about my process, my goals, and why I didn't work for a firm. I told her honestly that I'd applied to dozens, and no one wanted someone without a degree or connections. Nancy smiled slightly. Sometimes no one wants you until you prove they should have. That night she sent me an email. "If you're serious, I can help you get a small business loan, but you'll have to work harder than you ever thought possible." The next 6 years were exactly that, harder than I ever thought possible. The first year Dawson Studio was just me, a rented workshop space the size of a garage, and a second-hand drafting table. Clients canceled projects at the last minute, vendors overcharged, employees quit. I learned how to stretch $100 across a week. I sold my mother's old bracelet to cover payroll 1 month. There were nights I slept on the studio floor, waking up to the sound of delivery trucks outside. I kept going because quitting meant proving my father right. By 2019, I had enough steady clients to move into a proper office and hire my first full-time employee. By 2020, everything changed. A boutique hotel chain on the Oregon coast commissioned a full redesign of their interiors. The contract was 6 figures, the kind of job that could make or break me. I poured every ounce of energy into it. The day they unveiled the finished space, sunlight pouring through glass walls, the hotel owner said, "You made it feel alive. That was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. From there, the growth came fast. Word spread through design blogs. By 2023, Dawson's studio had expanded to Portland with 47 employees, 3 production teams, and a waiting list of clients. Our annual revenue reached $2.7 million. It sounded impressive, but the truth was simpler. I'd worked myself to the bone. Success was survival, not luxury. I stopped needing to prove anything. I just wanted peace. When the company stabilized, I started experimenting with investments. Not the kind my father bragged about, flashy real estate deals, but quiet strategic equity shares. I wanted to understand the machinery of money, not to depend on it, but to master it. One afternoon, while reviewing potential local partnerships, I came across a familiar name on a list of private companies seeking small investors. Dawson Realty Group. My father's company. I hadn't seen the name in years. Curiosity pulled me in. I invested a small amount through a holding company under my studio's account, just enough to receive quarterly reports. I told myself it was research. In reality, it was surveillance. When the first financial statement arrived, I nearly deleted it without reading. But something about the numbers caught my eye. Transfers listed as consulting fees to a firm called Whitaker Accounting, LLC. I'd never heard of them. The amounts were too round, too frequent. Every month, money moved out of corporate funds in identical increments, 50,000 here, 70 there, and always to Whitaker Accounting. I dug deeper, pulling up the company registration. The address traced back to a Pizza box in Nevada. The listed owner was James Whitaker, my father's brother-in-law. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my pulse steady but cold. For 2 weeks, I gathered reports, quietly comparing numbers. The pattern was clear, hundreds of thousands siphoned off through fake invoices. But what bothered me most wasn't the theft. It was that no one had noticed. Late one night, I found myself dialing a number Nancy had given me years ago, someone she called the man you want, when things smell wrong, Mark Turner. A gravelly voice answered. "Mr. Turner," I said. "I think I've found a financial crime." He chuckled. "Everyone thinks that at first. What makes you sure? Because the thief doesn't need to hide. The people in charge aren't even looking." There was a pause. Then he said, "You have files." "Dozens. Then I'll look into it. But if you're right, this isn't bookkeeping. It's federal." "Federal," I repeated. "Wire fraud, tax evasion, embezzlement. Pick one." I swallowed hard. "Then I need proof before anyone else does." He asked, "Why not go to the police? Because they won't believe me until they see what I see. And when they do, it'll already be too late for my family to pretend they didn't know." I hung up, staring at the city lights through my office window. Outside, Seattle rain fell against the glass in long streaks, distorting everything. For the first time, I realized I wasn't afraid of failure anymore. I was afraid of what the truth would cost. By the time Mark called back 2 months later, he had everything. Bank records, forged contracts, shell companies tied to my father's firm. The total nearly $500,000 stolen. His voice was calm when he said, "You were right, Claire. This isn't a mistake. It's a pattern. Someone's been bleeding your father's business dry for years." I stared at the evidence spread across my desk. "Then we stop it." "How?" he asked. "I'm going home," I said. "It's Christmas." The line went quiet. Then he murmured, "That's one way to make an entrance." Outside, the rain kept falling, and I knew before I even stepped back into that house, the storm had already started. The sound of my father's voice carried through the entire room like it owned the air. Next year, he announced, glass raised high. "Dawson Realty will open its Dallas branch. We're on track for the strongest quarter in company history." Applause burst out immediately, as if the guests were wired to respond. Ryan clapped first, his grin wide and polished. Mom's eyes shone with pride, the kind of glow that only appeared when my father performed well in public. I stood behind one of the marble columns near the dining room archway, half hidden, watching the familiar choreography unfold. Every year it was the same. The toast, the applause, the curated perfection of a family that looked like success. My father loved moments like this. Rooms where everyone listened to him, where his words shaped the reality people wanted to believe. To him, reputation was more than pride. It was armor. The only problem was that armor can hide a lot of cracks underneath. My voice inside felt calm, but heavy. My father believed reputation was everything. He forgot that reputation couldn't hide red ink. Ryan leaned close to one of the investors. You should see the Dallas project. We're finalizing financing next week. Financing that didn't exist, I thought. Financing that had been bleeding through fake accounts for years. I sipped my wine, trying to steady the storm inside me. I had spent weeks preparing for tonight, studying the evidence, memorizing every transfer. But now, standing there seeing my father so sure of himself, I felt something unexpected pity. 2 months earlier, Mark had sent me the audio file. You'll want to hear this, he said. I had played it alone in my office headphones on. James, my father's voice said on the recording, calm and deliberate move. 80,000 from the Dallas fund to the investment account. I need to close a deal this week. No one's watching those numbers anyway. James's voice came next, hesitant. You want me to file it as consulting expense? Do what you always do, my father replied. Just get it done. I had paused the recording halfway through, sitting there in silence. The anger came first, hot and sharp. But then it dissolved into something heavier, almost sorrowful. My father wasn't a criminal. He was terrified of looking like one. For as long as I could remember, he'd chased respect like oxygen. When I was a kid, he used to tell me, in business, people don't care about honesty. They care about winning. I never understood how he could say it so casually. Maybe he'd repeated it to himself so many times that it became truth. Now, watching him smile for cameras and pour another glass of wine, I realized he believed his own myth. The man who raised me on lectures about honor was living off borrowed ethics and other people's trust. He caught my eye across the room. Claire, he called. You've been hiding. Come join us. We're celebrating. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble. What are we celebrating exactly? Success, he said, motioning for a server to pour me a drink. Growth, the Dawson name. The server filled my glass with champagne. The bubbles rose like tiny ghosts. Sounds familiar, I said. He frowned slightly. You don't sound impressed. I've heard that speech before, I said, keeping my voice even. At least 10 times. He laughed it off. You should be proud, kiddo. Not many families can do what we've done. Everything I've built for you and Ryan. The irony hit me like a wave, but I kept my face neutral. For us, I repeated. Right. Ryan stepped in, slinging an arm around Dad's shoulder. She's just teasing. You know artists. They don't get numbers, Dad chuckled. That's why I handle the business and you kids get to chase your dreams. Dreams. I echoed the word dry on my tongue. He didn't hear the bitterness. Or maybe he did and chose not to. He raised his glass again. To family. Everyone around us echoed it, glasses, clinking voices blurring into a single, polished cheer. As I lifted mine, I caught a flash of my reflection in the mirror across the room. Me standing slightly apart, eyes steady, smile thin. The outsider at her own family's party. I took a slow sip and watched the champagne swirl. All the years of pretending were there in those bubbles. Thin, fragile, waiting to burst. Ryan leaned in to whisper something to an older investor. They both laughed quietly. Dad slapped him on the back, pride in every gesture. I remembered him saying, once, Ryan's got the Dawson charm. You got your mother's sensitivity. It's not a bad thing, just different. Different. That was his way of saying disappointing. Mom appeared beside me, the scent of her perfume, sharp and floral. Don't glare so much, she murmured. You'll get wrinkles. I'm not glaring, I said. You're thinking, she said, lowering her voice. Stop it. Tonight's for celebration. Of what? She smiled, that social smile of hers. Of us, darling. Isn't that enough? Her earrings caught the light as she turned away, moving gracefully toward her circle of friends. I watched her go, still stunned by how easily she could float above everything. When the speeches ended, the crowd began drifting toward the dining room. The caterers uncovered silver trays revealing roasted duck and cranberry-glazed ham. The smell was rich and warm, filling the air like a memory I couldn't stand. Dad was the last to sit. He tapped his glass with a fork until the chatter died down. Before we eat, he said, I want to thank my family for standing by me through another incredible year. To my wife, my son, our future. And to my daughter Claire. May she find her place in the world soon enough. Polite laughter scattered across the table. Ryan grinned. Mom beamed. I swallowed the sting behind my ribs. I forced a smile and lifted my glass. To funding it, I said quietly. He nodded, satisfied, already moving on to his next story. Inside me, the anger simmered steady and controlled. I could have said everything right there, laid out the files, the transfers, the recording. But that wasn't justice. That would have been chaos. Justice needed timing. Justice needed witnesses. So I smiled, met his eyes across the table, and raised my glass higher. To family, I said the words smooth and cold. He clinked his glass to mine. That's my girl. The guests cheered again, and I took another sip of champagne, the bubbles biting my throat. I let them talk, laugh, eat, and toast, all while the truth sat quietly in my pocket, waiting for its turn. Sometimes the hardest part of revealing the truth isn't speaking it. It's waiting for the exact moment when silence will hit harder than any word could. The living room smelled like champagne roses, and a hint of expensive perfume that clung to velvet and silk. The West Haven Ladies' Circle had claimed their usual corner. 5 women dressed in glitter and confidence clustered near the Christmas tree, snapping selfies that looked more like political campaign photos than memories. Every laugh felt practiced, every compliment transactional. My mother. Eleanor Dawson stood at the center of them in a fitted red gown that shimmered under the chandelier. Her lipstick matched her dress, her diamonds caught every flash. She looked like she'd stepped out of a holiday catalog, graceful, untouchable, perfect. She thrived in this world of illusion where control was power and truth was impolite. Claire still does her little art projects, she said, waving a manicured hand as one of the women asked about me. It keeps her busy, thank goodness. She's always had such creative energy. They smiled, politely dismissive. I was standing only the few feet away near the drink cart, close enough to hear every word. Karen Mills, my mother's oldest friend and the self-appointed gossip queen of the group, leaned in. Eleanor. I probably shouldn't say this, but someone I know at Pacific Bank mentioned your husband's loans are under review. Just a routine thing, I'm sure. Her tone carried the same sweetness as poison. My mother's smile didn't falter. Rumors. Karen, you know how people love to talk. She took a delicate sip of champagne. Thomas is expanding faster than ever. The Dallas branch is already a success. Karen nodded, pretending to believe her. Of course. I just worry, that's all. My mother placed her hand over Karen's wrist with mock affection. Don't. We Dawsons have never been stronger. I almost laughed. I didn't. Years of practice had taught me how to stay still, how to keep the truth behind my teeth until the moment it mattered. Mom continued, her voice lifting with that performative cheer she used when someone important was listening. Our family is very fortunate. No drama, no secrets. Not like some others in town. We've kept everything. Spotless. Spotless. I repeated the word in my head, tasting its irony. When I was a kid, my mother used to tell me that appearances are everything. Once, when a teacher called home because I'd argued with a classmate about fairness, she'd said, "You don't have to be right, Claire. You just have to look right." That sentence stuck with me for years. Tonight, it felt like the final thread connecting us. I watched her now laughing too loudly at a joke, her hand brushing the diamond cross on her neck. Her friends mirrored her laughter, each of them eager to prove their lives were perfect too. Karen lifted her phone, snapping another photo. Come on, ladies, one more for the group chat. They gathered close, pretending to toast. My mother leaned in at just the right angle, smile bright enough to hide the cracks. From where I stood, I could see my reflection in the mirror behind them. Same blue eyes, same jawline, but different worlds entirely. She lived for the image. I'd spent my life breaking out of it. I turned away, scanning the room. Waiters in white shirts carried trays of shrimp cocktails and mini crab cakes. The pianist switched from jazz to a slow version of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. The air hummed with luxury and denial. I checked my phone. A message from Mark Turner flashed across the screen. Confirmed. James withdrew $480,000. Documentation complete. My heart kicked once steady and cold. I typed back, "Oh, hold position. I'll take care of it tonight." When I slipped the phone into my clutch, it felt heavier than it should have. Behind me, my mother's voice carried again. "We're truly blessed, you know. The Dawsons don't have flaws." Her friends clapped politely, glasses raised. I turned, meeting her eyes for a split second. She saw me, standing there calm, quiet, and her smile wavered just enough for me to notice. Maybe she thought I'd overheard her. Maybe she thought I'd forgive her for saying it. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt inevitability. I moved through the crowd, refilling my glass at the bar. Across the room, my father's laughter boomed again. Ryan was retelling the story of his six-figure deal, oblivious to the world beyond his own reflection. Mom caught up to me near the fireplace, lowering her voice. "You look upset." "Don't. It's Christmas." "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm watching. Watching what?" "How people mistake noise for happiness." She gave me that look, a mix of annoyance and warning. "Don't be cynical, Claire. People are watching you too. Try to smile." "I will." I said, "When there's something real to smile about." She frowned but turned away before I could say anything else. She had a photo to pose for a life to maintain. As she walked back to her friends, I studied her posture. The straight back, the graceful hands, the confident steps. She'd spent decades perfecting the performance of elegance. I used to think it was strength. Now I knew it was fear. The crowd burst into laughter again as someone announced that dinner would be served soon. Plates clinked, champagne poured, the pianist began another song. From the outside, the Dawsons were untouchable. Inside, the foundation was already crumbling. I checked my watch. Almost 8. The right moment was approaching. My phone buzzed once more. A single text from Mark. "Ready when you are." I took one last look at my mother, surrounded by her friends, radiant and unshakable. "Our family has no flaws," she'd said. In less than an hour, that illusion would be gone forever. I raised my glass, pretending to join the toast from across the room. My reflection shimmered in the window beside me, layered over the dark stretch of the Pacific outside. The ocean doesn't care about reputation. It devours everything, eventually. I took a slow sip of champagne and whispered just for myself, "Let's see how perfect we still are by midnight." The music had softened to something slow and polite, the kind of instrumental track meant to make money and manners sound the same. The lights dimmed a little, the fire glowed gold against the marble, and the guests began exchanging gifts. Paper rustled, champagne glasses clinked, and a chorus of "Oh, you shouldn't have" filled the air. When my turn came, I stood, the small silver box in my hands, gleaming under the chandelier. I could feel every set of eyes follow me as I walked toward my father at the head of the table. The scent of pine and roasted duck mixed with the faint metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. "Dad," I said, stopping beside his chair, "I brought something for you." He looked up from his glass, a lazy smile spreading across his face. "Claire," he said with mock warmth, "you don't need to do this. Don't try so hard to impress anyone. No one expects you to keep up." His words landed like a familiar slap. The same tone he used when he said, "You'll never understand business, or you don't know what it takes to win." Ryan leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Let me guess," he said loudly. "Another one of those handmade gifts. Maybe a picture frame from a thrift shop, that'd be on brand." Laughter rippled through the table. Quick, mean collective. The kind of laugh people use when they want to feel safe on the winning side. I smiled faintly. "You might be surprised," I said. Dad chuckled. "Claire, really. You don't have to pretend. We all know money's not your thing. Just sit, enjoy the evening." I met his eyes. "Mom." I said instead, turning toward her, "Why don't you open it?" The room stilled. Forks paused midair. Even the pianist faltered for half a second before resuming. My mother's smile froze in place. "Me," she said, setting down her napkin. "Darling, you shouldn't have." "Please," I said gently. "It's for you." Her hands hesitated over the ribbon. For a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear maybe, or instinct. The sound of wrapping paper tearing through silence was louder than the music. The lid came off. Instead of jewelry or perfume, a stack of thick, cream-colored folders sat neatly inside. The top one bore the embossed logo of Dawson Realty Group. The title beneath it read Financial Records, 2020 to 2023. My mother blinked, confused. "What is this?" My father's expression darkened instantly. "Claire," he said, voice low, "what are you doing?" I took a step closer, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. "It's the reason your Dallas expansion won't happen," I said. "The reason your company is running on air." Ryan laughed nervously. "Jesus, Claire. What the hell are you talking about?" I reached into the box and pulled out a single sheet, a bank statement marked in blue ink. "This," I said, holding it up, "is a transfer of $480,000 from Dawson Realty's operational fund to a private account under the name Whitaker Accounting, LLC. The room erupted in murmurs. Someone whispered my father's name. My mother sat frozen, her hands trembling around the edge of the box. Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "This is nonsense," he barked. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Ryan got up too, his face flushed. "Stop embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing myself," I said quietly. "You mean the way this family's been embarrassing itself for years without even realizing it?" My father's jaw tightened. "That's enough." "Not yet," I said. "Do you recognize this name?" I pointed to the transfer line. "James Whitaker, your brother-in-law, the man you trust with your books. Karen Mills." My mother's friend gasped from across the table. Her wine glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. The sound rang through the silence like a bell. "Whitaker," she repeated. "But he's family." "Exactly," I said, which makes the betrayal harder to see, or maybe easier to ignore. My mother looked between us, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, is this true?" He glared at me. "You don't know what you're saying. Those are internal transactions. Business expenses." "Really?" I laid another sheet on the table. An invoice dated last April signed by both him and James, because according to the wire logs, the money went straight into James's personal account in Nevada. Ryan stepped forward, his hand gripping the back of his chair. "You've been snooping through our finances. You hacked Dad's company." "I didn't hack anything," I said. "I invested. Through a shell company, which gave me access to quarterly reports. And what I found," I glanced around the room, meeting each pair of stunned eyes, "was theft. $500,000 worth." Gasps spread like wind through dry grass. Dad slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. You don't bring this filth into my house on Christmas Eve." My voice stayed level. "I didn't bring filth." "Dad, I brought facts." His face turned red. "You will not stand here and accuse me of—" "I'm not accusing you," I cut in. "I'm asking you, how long have you known?" The question hung in the air, heavy and alive. No one moved. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Mom's voice trembled. "Thomas." He didn't answer. Ryan shouted, "You're insane, Claire. You've lost your mind." "No," I said softly. "I've just stopped pretending." The words slipped out before I could stop them. They landed with a finality that even I hadn't expected. My father took a step toward me, his hand raised, not to hit, but to silence. "Enough. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "Yes," I said, finally. The guests were standing now, uneasy, gathering coats and purses. Karen was whispering into her phone, probably already feeding the rumor mill. My mother rose slowly, pale, her hands still shaking. "Claire," she said weakly, "please don't." I looked at her, my voice softening. "I'm sorry, Mom, but pretending we're perfect doesn't make us whole. And tonight we can't afford silence anymore." My father's face hardened into something unreadable. For the first time he looked smaller, as if the air had been sucked out of him. He pointed toward the door. "Get out! No!" I said, standing my ground. Not this time. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The fire cracked loudly, the only sound left. Then quietly, I placed the remaining documents on the table beside him. "The truth was always going to come out," I said. "I just chose when." The silence that followed was absolute. So deep I could hear my own pulse. Every act, every lie, every toast had led to this moment, and as I looked around at the faces frozen in disbelief, I thought every performance ends when the lights finally come on. Tonight the lights had found us. The room had gone completely still. The only sounds were the soft crackle from the fireplace and the faint melody of Silent Night bleeding through the speakers, awkwardly out of place now. My father stood frozen at the head of the table, his face flushed the color of wine. His jaw worked, but no words came out at first. When he finally spoke, it was through clenched teeth. "This," he said, each word clipped and deliberate, "is company business, not something to be paraded in front of guests." I straightened my back, meeting his glare. "No, it's not just company business, Dad. It's family business. Because you used Mom's name to open a secondary account." He blinked, the color draining from his face. I reached into my bag and pulled out another document, one I'd kept aside for this exact moment. I unfolded it slowly and slid it across the table. The account was opened under Eleanor Dawson. That's her signature. And here, I pointed to the bottom line, is yours authorizing it. My mother's hand shot out before she even realized it, trembling as she grabbed the paper. Her eyes darted over the text and her lips parted as she read her own name. Thomas, she whispered. Tell me this isn't real. It's not what it looks like, he snapped, but his voice cracked on the last word. Ryan pushed back from his chair and strode toward me. Give me that, he said, reaching for the folder. You don't know what you're talking about. I stepped aside, keeping the paper out of reach. Touch me again and you'll regret it, I said quietly. My tone must have startled him. He froze mid-step. I turned my attention back to Dad. Do you want me to stop? I asked. Because I can stop now, or I can show them everything. He opened his mouth, but I was already moving. From my clutch, I pulled my laptop, flipped it open, and pressed play. On the screen, numbers scrolled across a spreadsheet. Account balances, transaction IDs, offshore transfers. The guests leaned in, whispers rippling through the room. Someone gasped when they saw a total $480,000 consulting fees. I said, my voice steady. All to Whitaker Accounting, a company that doesn't actually exist. Well, it does technically, but it's registered to a POS box in Nevada. My father's voice boomed suddenly. Turn that off, right now. His shout bounced off the high ceiling, startling the guests. A few people flinched. Someone dropped a fork. The Christmas playlist stopped abruptly, as if even the music didn't dare continue. Thomas, one of the men, his colleague from the bank, said carefully, Maybe we should talk privately. No, I said sharply, louder than I intended. The room turned toward me again. No more private talks, no more closed doors. My mother sank back into her chair, her face pale, her mascara smudging under her eyes. Thomas, tell me she's lying. He said nothing. The silence stretched unbearable. Across the table, Karen Mills stood near the doorway, clutching her phone at her chest. I saw her screen light up. She was filming. You can't record this. My father barked, pointing at her, but it was too late. Another guest had their phone out too. The modern plague of public image, exactly what he'd spent his whole life protecting, was now devouring him in real time. Turn it off! He roared, slamming his fist against the table. Glasses toppled, champagne spilled across the white cloth like blood. The sound made everyone flinch. I didn't move. You can scare them, I said quietly, but you can't scare the truth. His head snapped toward me. For a moment, I thought he might actually hit something, or someone. But then his shoulders dropped, and he just stared at me, lost. My mother's voice came out in a trembling whisper. Thomas, what did you do? He didn't answer. Ryan's voice cracked through the silence next. This is crazy. Dad wouldn't do that. You're making a fool of yourself, Claire. I ignored him. I turned the laptop toward him instead. Do you recognize your signature? Because you signed off on at least one of these wire transfers. You thought you were approving a vendor payment, but you were moving money out of the company. Your name is on it. Ryan's face went blank, all color gone. That's not possible, he muttered. It's there, I said softly. I checked it twice. He stumbled back a step, running a hand through his hair. No, that's not. Dad barked. Don't talk to her, Ryan. She's twisting everything. I closed the laptop with a soft click. Am I? Nobody answered. The silence grew thick again, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the soft hum of the heater. Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs, a faint echo beneath the tension. Mom's hand went to her throat. Thomas, please say something. He looked at her, his expression shifting between anger and exhaustion. You think I wanted this? He said, voice rising again. You think I asked for this? You signed it, she cried. You used my name. I did it for us, he said. To keep us afloat, to protect what we built. Protect her. Laugh came out sharp and wet. You destroyed it. I stood still, the weight of everything pressing down, but I felt strangely calm. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, when the truth stopped being an idea and became undeniable. Behind me, someone whispered, Is this for real? Yes, I said, not turning around. Every number, every transaction. It's all real. Karen's phone chimed with a new message. She looked at the screen, eyes widening. I didn't need to ask. I knew what it meant. The video was already spreading. The whispers had left the house. Dad's breathing was heavy now, his chest rising and falling. He looked around the room at the faces of people who used to admire him, and realized they were looking at him differently. Not as a leader. As a liar. "Get out," he said hoarsely. "All of you." No one moved. He slammed his hand on the table again. "Get out." The guests began gathering their things in stunned silence, coats pulled tight, eyes averted. The glittering party had turned into an exodus. When the last of them slipped out, the house was left in a heavy quiet. My mother collapsed into the nearest chair, her hands covering her face. Ryan stood frozen still, trying to process what had just happened. My father turned toward the fireplace, his back to us. "I built this family," he said, voice hollow. "I gave you everything." I looked at him. "And in the process, you lost yourself." He didn't reply. He just stared into the flames for a long time, before walking out of the room, the sound of his shoes fading down the hall until the front door slammed. The silence that followed was deeper than any I'd ever known. My mother's shoulders trembled as she whispered, "What happens now?" I didn't answer. I didn't know yet. All I knew was that the performance was over, and we were standing in the ashes of the truth. Through the window, the Christmas lights reflected faintly on the glass, beautiful, fragile, and cold. By morning, the story was everywhere. The headline on the San Diego Register read, "Dawson Realty under investigation for $480,000 embezzlement scheme." The photo beneath it was of my father leaving the house, head down, hand raised to block the cameras. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from reporters, messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Even a voicemail from a producer asking if I'd consider telling my side. I deleted them all. At 9 a.m., Mark Turner and I met outside the Dawson Realty building downtown. The glass facade reflected the overcast sky, a fitting mirror for what was left of the company's reputation. My attorney, David Ross, joined us on the steps, carrying a thick folder of legal documents. Inside the lobby was tense. Employees avoided eye contact, whispering as I passed. Someone had already removed the framed Business of the Year plaque from the front desk. The receptionist pretended to type an email, her hands shaking slightly. Thomas wasn't in his office. He'd been summoned by the board for an emergency meeting. An hour ago, Ryan's nameplate had been taken off his office door. My mother's car wasn't in the lot. It was as if the family had evaporated overnight, leaving only the wreckage. We entered the conference room where Detective Cole Harris from the San Diego Police Department sat waiting. He was mid-40s, tired, eyes, calm voice. "Ms. Dawson," he said, standing to shake my hand. "We appreciate your cooperation. Mr. Turner speaks highly of your thoroughness." Mark smirked. "Told you she does her homework." I sat down, setting the laptop and folders on the table. David slid over the signed affidavit, confirming the transfer of evidence. "Everything's here," he said. "Financial records, internal emails, signatures. Enough to charge James Whitaker with wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." Detective Harris nodded, flipping through the documents. "You're sure your father wasn't complicit?" The question lingered in the air. I forced myself to breathe evenly. "I'm sure he knew," I said finally. "But I don't believe he started it. He just looked the other way." Harris gave a small nod, jotting something down. "That happens more often than you'd think." I signed the final transfer form. My hand didn't shake. I'd been waiting for this moment for weeks, yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like cleaning up after a storm that never should have happened. When the paperwork was done, Harris gathered everything and stood. "We'll move quickly," he said. "If Whitaker's smart, he'll lawyer up. If he's stupid, he'll run." Mark leaned back in his chair. "My money's on stupid." The detective smiled faintly, then left. For a moment, none of us spoke. The hum of the building's air conditioner filled the silence. Then Mark turned to me. "You did the right thing." "I didn't do it for them," I said. "I did it because someone had to." He nodded. "Doesn't change what it cost you." Outside, the sky had turned gray. Reporters waited near the front doors, cameras ready. I slipped out the side exit with Mark and David, avoiding the flashes. Back at my studio, the air smelled like cedar and paint thinner, the scent of work, of things I could still control. I poured coffee and sat at my drafting table, trying to lose myself in lines and textures. But my phone buzzed again. Ryan. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. What I said, his voice was rough. "I need to see you." An hour later, he showed up at the studio, looking like he hadn't slept. The confident smile was gone. His tie was loose, his hair uncombed. "Don't say anything," he said quickly, stepping inside. "Just let me explain." I folded my arms. "Go ahead. I didn't know what I was signing." He said, pacing. "James told me they were just supplier invoices. He said Dad approved them. Did you read them?" He stopped walking. No, I just signed where he told me to. Then you knew, I said. You didn't want to know, but you knew. He shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. Claire, please, I didn't mean to. I thought it was normal business stuff. Normal business doesn't hide money in Nevada, I said. Normal business doesn't use our mother's name on fake accounts. He covered his face with his hands. I messed up, I know that. But I can't lose everything. I sighed, the weight of exhaustion pressing behind my eyes. Ryan, you've spent your whole life depending on Dad to fix things. You've never once stood on your own 2 feet. That's not fair, he snapped. It's true, I said. And now there's no one left to clean up after you. He looked at me like a child who'd just been told monsters were real. His voice cracked. So what do I do? Tell the truth. I said simply. He blinked, confused. That's it. That's all there ever was. I walked to my desk and pulled out a smaller folder. Inside were copies of the same documents we'd handed the detective that morning. Emails, transaction receipts, timestamps. I held it out to him. You want a chance to start over? Give this to the police. Tell them exactly what you signed and when. He stared at the folder like it was a loaded gun. You're asking me to ruin Dad. I met his eyes. No, he ruined himself. You're just deciding whether you'll follow him down. His shoulders slumped. He took the folder slowly, his hands shaking. I can't believe this is real. It's as real as the money that's gone, I said quietly. For a long time he didn't move. Then he nodded once, turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. You know, he said, his voice breaking. Dad always said you were the one who didn't understand the business. Guess he was right, just not the way he thought. When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The studio was silent again except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Mark appeared in the doorway, hands in his coat pockets. He's going to do it, he said. I know. Mark studied me for a moment, then said quietly, You're not just cleaning up a scandal, Claire. You're rebuilding a legacy. I turned toward the window where the afternoon light was breaking through the clouds over Puget Sound, thin and uncertain, but real. Maybe I said, but sometimes rebuilding means letting the old one burn first. Mark didn't argue. He just nodded and left me alone with the quiet. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. The headlines, the police, the shame, they were all background noise now. What mattered was what came next. And for the first time in years, I didn't need anyone else to decide that for me. James Whitaker was arrested in Reno 3 days later. The news broke before breakfast. His mugshot appeared on every local station. The same gray suit and smug half-smile that used to charm investors, now frozen under the headline, Whitaker, accounting executive, arrested in Dawson Realty fraud case. By noon, CNN's local affiliate had picked up the story. I watched the footage in silence as a reporter stood outside Dawson Realty's shuttered headquarters, the building where I'd spent my childhood pretending the world was as polished as its marble floors. Sources close to the investigation confirm that company founder Thomas Dawson may have been aware of the embezzlement, the anchor said, though it remains unclear whether he was directly involved. The words felt like a cold hand gripping my chest. I knew this was coming. The ripple effect, but hearing my father's name said like that on national television made the reality heavier. At the Dawson house, my mother sat alone in the darkened living room. Her phone had been ringing non-stop since dawn. Reporters, former friends, even members of her charity committee, calling under the guise of concern, but really just fishing for gossip. At one point, she simply pulled the plug from the wall, dropped her cell into a drawer, and sat staring at the muted TV. By afternoon, she stopped answering the door. I found out later that the West Haven Ladies' Circle had called an emergency meeting that morning. Karen Mills, the same woman who'd once begged for my mother's contacts to join the club, was the first to speak. This scandal reflects on all of us, she said, tapping her nails against the glass table. Eleanor has embarrassed the circle. We can't be associated with that kind of chaos. They agreed, when my mother walked in halfway through the meeting, still in her robe, her hair undone. The room went silent. She tried to smile. Karen. I just came to say. Karen didn't look at her. This isn't personal, Eleanor. It's about the integrity of our group. Another woman shifted uncomfortably. Maybe when things calm down, we can revisit. Integrity. My mother repeated softly, as if testing the word on her tongue. Her gaze moved around the room. Not one person met her eyes. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the tile. No one stooped to clean it up. She didn't say another word. She turned and left the sound of her heels echoing through the hallway like gunshots. When I got her text that evening, "Can you come by?" I didn't hesitate. The drive to La Jolla felt longer than usual, the cliffs wrapped in mist, the ocean a dull gray smear against the horizon. By the time I reached the house, twilight had settled, and the windows glowed dimly against the dark. I found her sitting in the den, the same place where she'd hosted those perfect parties, surrounded by crystal decanters and silver-framed photos of smiling people who wouldn't answer her calls now. She hadn't turned on any lights. The only glow came from the fireplace. "Mom." She didn't look up. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Her voice was thin, hollow. "You asked me to. I didn't think you'd actually come after what I said." I pulled off my coat, sat across from her. "You mean when you said I destroyed our reputation?" Her eyes met mine, red, tired. "You did. You tore it to pieces." I exhaled slowly. "No, Mom. I cleaned it." She blinked, confused. "Cleaned it." "Reputation isn't the same as integrity," I said. "You spent years polishing the outside of this family while everything inside was rotting. I just pulled down the wallpaper." Tears slipped down her cheeks, glinting in the firelight. "You don't understand. Reputation was all we had. Without it, what are we?" "People," I said softly. "Flawed. Human. Capable of starting over." She looked away, her shoulders trembling. "When I married your father, he told me one thing. As long as we look strong, no one can hurt us." I believed him. I built my life around that lie. And now, look at us. I glanced around the room. The chandelier above us had one bulb flickering out. The scent of old perfume lingered mixed with smoke. On the mantel, our family portrait still hung, my father's arm draped over her shoulders. Ryan standing tall, me off to the side like an afterthought. "You could take it down," I said. "Start fresh." She gave a sad laugh. "You sound like a therapist." "I sound like your daughter," I said. "The one you stopped listening to." That broke something. Her face crumpled, and for the first time in my life, my mother didn't look perfect. She looked real. She whispered, "I didn't mean to hurt you, Claire. I just thought, if we kept up appearances long enough, maybe they'd become true." I moved closer, sitting beside her. "Pretending doesn't make truth. It just delays it." She turned toward me, then eyes glassy but focused. "When you were little," she said, voice trembling, "you used to sit by that window for hours drawing pictures of the ocean. You'd tell me you wanted to design houses that made people feel safe. I told you to stop dreaming. Do you remember?" "I remember," I said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "But I was just afraid you'd end up like me, dependent on a man to define you." We sat there in silence for a long time, the fire crackling softly. The air between us felt fragile like the first thaw after winter. Finally, she reached for my hand. Her palm was cold. Maybe I should learn how to be a real person again. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just squeezed her hand gently. The house was quiet except for the rain beginning to fall outside, steady and cleansing. It tapped against the windows in a rhythm that felt almost like forgiveness. I looked at her. This woman who had built her life around perfection and finally painfully was letting it crumble, and I realized that this was the beginning of something neither of us had ever had before: truth. She stared into the fire and whispered, "I always thought strength meant never letting anyone see you break," I said. "Sometimes strength is breaking in front of them and standing up anyway." Her eyes met mine again, and this time there was no distance in them, no pride, no shame, just understanding. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the ocean roared beyond the cliffs. And for the first time in years, the Dawson house felt almost clean. Ryan's name disappeared from the Dawson Realty directory first. Quietly, without a statement, just gone. By the end of the week, his company email was deactivated, his office cleared out. When the news broke that he'd been removed from executive duties, his old friends stopped returning his calls. Clients who used to invite him to golf tournaments suddenly forgot his number. I didn't hear from him until a small white envelope showed up at my studio 2 days later. No return address. Just my name written in his neat, slanted handwriting. I knew, before I even opened it, what it was, inside a single page. "Claire, you were right. You did the right thing. I just didn't have the guts to face it. Maybe someday I will. I'm leaving San Diego for a while, to figure out who I am when I'm not living off someone else's shadow. Take care of Mom, and take care of the family because you're the only one left who knows how. Ryan. The paper smelled faintly of his cologne, the one he used to wear when he wanted to seem important. I folded it carefully and set it on the desk. I should have felt relief. Instead, I just felt the dull ache of something breaking that had already been cracked for years. That night, while I was working late, I got a text from one of the studio assistants, a photo of the downtown bus terminal, time-stamped 11:48 p.m. Ryan stood there, in the picture, head down, backpack, slung over his shoulder suitcase beside him. He looked small, almost anonymous. The caption read, "He's gone." The next morning, I drove to my father's office. The front of the building still bore the faint shadow where the Dawson Realty logo had been removed. The walls were stripped bare. The air smelled of dust and disinfectant. I found him sitting behind his desk, staring at the empty spot where the company plaque had hung for 20 years. He didn't look up right away. His hair, once perfectly groomed, had gone gray at the edges, and his suit hung a little loose. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost fragile. "You came. You called." I said. He nodded slowly. "I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you wanted me to." He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know where to begin. You can start," I said by not pretending. He gave a hollow laugh. "That's fair." His eyes met mine then, and for the first time in years, I didn't see anger or superiority, just exhaustion. "Do you know how long I've been doing this? Claire building, fixing, patching things before they fall apart? I thought if I could hold everything together long enough, it would make me strong. Turns out I was just holding on to lies. I said nothing, letting him talk. He gestured vaguely toward the window. This company was supposed to be my legacy, the proof that I mattered. I wanted people to look at the name Dawson and think of success, not failure. "Dad," I said quietly, "you can't build legacy on denial. It always collapses." He looked down his fingers, drumming the edge of the desk. I thought protecting the family meant keeping up appearances. Turns out that's what destroyed us. I stepped closer, the sunlight from the blinds cutting thin lines across the floor between us. "You didn't protect us, Dad. You suffocated us. You made us believe perfection was survival." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on his hands. "You sound like your mother." "She finally stopped sounding like you," I said. That earned a faint smile. "Touché." He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I've been to hell these past few weeks. The board wants me out completely. The lawyers think I should plead ignorance and retire quietly. Maybe you should." Maybe he murmured. "But before I disappear, I need to know something. Do you hate me?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I took a long breath before answering. "No, I don't hate you. I just can't keep saving the version of you that never existed." He nodded, accepting it like a sentence he'd already known was coming. The silence stretched again, broken only by the hum of the building's old heater. Finally, he said, "If you want the company, it's yours." I blinked. "What I already told the lawyers. They'll draft the papers. You can take over, restructure it however you want." He paused. "Maybe you can turn it into something honest for once." I stared at him. "You're serious?" He nodded. "You're the only one who deserves it now. I've run out of reasons to pretend I can fix it." The weight of his words settled between us like the dust in the sunbeams. "Dad," I said quietly, "I don't know if I want it." "I know," he said, "but at least think about it. Maybe it's time a Dawson finally earned what they had instead of inheriting it." He pushed back from the desk, stood, and walked to the window. The skyline stretched out before him, bright and sharp against the pale blue. "I used to love this view," he said softly. "Now it just feels like a mirror I can't stand to look into." I stood behind him for a long moment, then said, "You don't have to fix it all, Dad. You just have to stop breaking it." He laughed under his breath. But it wasn't cruel this time. "You always were the smart one." I shook my head. "No, just the one who finally stopped running." When he turned back, there was something different in his eyes, something I hadn't seen since I was a kid, humility. He sat down again, shoulders slumping, as if he'd just let go of something heavy. "If you do this, if you take it over," he said, "don't make the same mistake I did. Don't chase pride. Chase purpose." I didn't respond. I just looked at him. This man who'd spent a lifetime performing strength and finally in weakness had become real. For the first time, I didn't see the titan of business, or the father who'd disappointed me. I just saw a man who'd finally stopped lying to himself. He reached across the desk, his hand trembling slightly. I hesitated, then placed mine in his. "Whatever you do, Claire," he said softly, "make it count." I nodded. The sunlight shifted across the room, washing the walls in gold. It felt like an ending, and the start of something I wasn't ready to name yet. When I left the building, the last of the workers were removing the sign from the front entrance. The metal letters that once spelled Dawson Realty clattered into a bin one by one. The echo followed me out into the street, sharp and final. A week later, the boardroom felt colder than I remembered. The winter light cut across the polished table, throwing pale stripes over the chairs, the glass walls. The people seated in uncomfortable silence. David Ross sat to my left, shuffling documents. Across from us, the board members whispered among themselves, some sympathetic, most guarded. My father stood at the head of the table, his shoulders slightly hunched. A man stripped of his usual armor. "This meeting," he began to a voice low but steady, "is to finalize the transition of leadership at Dawson Realty." He paused, looking around the room. "I've spent 35 years trying to make this company a symbol of success. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that symbols mean nothing without substance." No one moved. Even the HVAC hum seemed to still. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key, the one that had always hung from his belt loop when I was a kid. "The key to the executive office." He turned toward me. "I lived for the Dawson name," he said, his voice catching. "My daughter will live for what that name should have meant." He held out the key. For a moment, I didn't move. My heart was loud in my chest. Then I stood, crossed the room, and took it from his hand. The metal was warm from his touch. David slid the final set of documents toward me. "Ms. Dawson," he said formally, "please sign the acceptance of transfer of authority." My father watched as I picked up the pen. The weight of the moment pressed down hard, not in a way that suffocated, but in a way that demanded reverence. The pen scratched across the page, one signature. My name, where his had always been. When I looked up, the room had changed. The men who'd once laughed at my father's jokes now avoided his eyes. Some glanced at me, a few with quiet respect, others with caution. "Congratulations," one of them said softly. I nodded, but didn't smile. "This isn't celebration," I said. "It's reconstruction." The meeting adjourned soon after. One by one, the board members filed out. Papers rustled, chairs scraped the floor. When it was just the three of us left, my father, David, and me. He exhaled shakily. "I should go," he said. He turned toward the door, pausing in the hallway, where sunlight spilled through the tall windows. The company's logo, half removed, half polished, still gleamed faintly on the wall. He reached out and touched the edge of one letter. "I laughed," he said quietly, "almost to himself when you brought that gift box to the house. I stood in the doorway, listening. I thought it was just another attempt to prove yourself." He went on. "I didn't realize it was the only thing in that room that was real." He looked back at me, eyes tired but clear. "The truth you gave us. That was the gift, Claire. I see that now." I stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. Words weren't necessary. The sunlight coming through the glass hit the side of his face, softening the lines that years of pride had carved there. He covered my hand with his for a moment, then let go, and walked down the corridor without another word. When the door closed behind him, I stood there a while, letting the quiet settle. Then I turned and walked toward the office that now bore my name. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old cologne. The desk was cleared except for a single framed photograph, our family, in front of the first house he'd ever bought. Ryan was maybe 10. I was 13. Mom still radiant in the way people are before they realize how much they'll lose. I set my purse down and walked to the window. The ocean stretched beyond the building's bright blue against the cliffs of La Jolla. From here, I could almost see the house, its red roof small against the horizon. On the desk sat the binder I'd brought with me, the restructuring plan. A new financial model, sustainability goals. Transparent accounting. The kind of integrity my father once said was idealistic. I smiled faintly at the word now. As I flipped through the pages, my reflection in the window shifted. No longer the outsider, no longer the disappointment. Just me. I walked around the office, touching the edges of the furniture, the wood polished but worn. My father's chair still creaked when I sat in it. For a second, I closed my eyes and let the weight of it sink in. I remembered the first time I'd visited this office as a child, how the world had felt so big and unattainable. Back then, I thought success looked like glass walls and business suits. Now I knew it looked like owning your mistakes and still moving forward. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, turning gold against the water. The reflection of the waves danced across the walls. I picked up the photo again, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. "We made it through," I whispered. Not untouched, but through. When I set the photo back down, something inside me felt still, like a knot had finally loosened. For the first time in years, the Dawson name didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an open space. I sat at the desk, opened my notebook, and began to write the first directive as the new CEO. The pen moved slowly at first, then steadier. Restore trust. Rebuild foundation. Reclaim meaning. The sound of the pen on paper echoed softly in the room. The company outside the door buzzed faintly with new energy, hesitant, uncertain, but alive. When I finished, I closed the notebook, stood, and looked once more through the glass wall. The sea shimmered endless and forgiving. I pressed my hand against the window palm, warm against the cool glass, and breathed deeply. For the first time, peace didn't feel like surrender. It felt like strength. A year later, the name Dawson meant something again, but not what it used to. The company had recovered slowly and quietly. No headlines, no grand rebranding campaign, just steady work and honest numbers. The same board members who once doubted me now trusted my word more than quarterly reports. Transparency had become our new luxury. We downsized, restructured, rebuilt. The Dallas project was finished on time this time, under clean contracts and verified funding. Our employees were paid properly, no hidden fees, no offshore accounts. The pride I felt wasn't loud. It was the kind that settled deep in my chest like calm water. Outside the company, I built something of my own, a non-profit foundation for young artists named the Eleanor Fund. My mother cried the day she saw the sign go up. It wasn't a charity meant to polish our reputation. It was a bridge for people like me, dreamers who had been told that art was impractical, that survival mattered more than purpose. The fund paid for workshops, small grants, exhibitions. Every time a young artist signed their first sale contract, I felt like I was handing a piece of my past a second chance. That December, we spent Christmas together again. No champagne towers or catering this time, just family, a few friends, and the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey filling the house. The living room looked different now. The old chandelier was gone, replaced by simple string lights that cast a soft glow over everything. The fireplace crackled, and the tree was smaller, decorated with mismatched ornaments, some handmade by Lily. Ryan came through the front door first, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, looking older but lighter somehow. Mom rushed to him before he could say a word, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that erased a year's worth of silence. "I missed you," she whispered. He held her tighter. "I missed you too, Mom." My father sat near the fire watching. His hair had gone grayer, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. When Ryan finally walked over, Dad stood uncertain for a moment, then extended his hand. Ryan hesitated before gripping it firmly. "I heard you've been doing good work in Denver," Dad said. Ryan nodded, trying to earn it this time. A quiet smile crossed Dad's face. That's all that matters. They didn't need to say more. Some apologies didn't need words. They lived in the space between gestures. I watched them, feeling something unclench in me. Mom called everyone to the table. There were only 6 of us: Mimi, Mom, Dad, Ryan, his daughter Lily, and Mark Turner, who'd become less of an investigator and more of an old family friend. We passed the food around the conversation light. For the first time, no one mentioned business or deals or reputation. Halfway through dinner, Lily turned to me, eyes curious. "Aunt Claire." "Yes, sweetheart." She twirled her fork between her fingers. "Last Christmas when Grandpa laughed at you. When everyone did. Why didn't you get mad?" The room went quiet for a beat. My father's hand paused mid-air. Ryan looked down at his plate. I smiled softly. Because the truth doesn't need to yell to be heard. Lily tilted her head. What does that mean? It means, I said, glancing at my parents, that sometimes silence says everything. Mom's eyes glistened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Thank you, she said quietly. You didn't just save the company, Claire. You saved all of us. I shook my head. I didn't save anyone. I just did what you both taught me. Keep our honor, even when it hurts. Dad swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. You've given this family something I never could. What's that? I asked. He smiled faintly. Peace. After dinner, we moved to the patio overlooking the cliffs. The Pacific stretched out in silver and black, the lights from La Jolla glittering in the distance. The cold air carried the scent of salt and pine. Lily ran out with a mug of cocoa, pointing to the Christmas lights strung along the railing. Look, she said. They look like stars in the water. We all turned toward the ocean. The reflection shimmered on the waves. Gold, green, red, a mirror of everything we'd lost and rebuilt. No one spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the ocean breathing against the rocks and the wind threading through the pine trees. I thought about the year before, the shouting, the shame, the silence that followed, and how different this quiet felt. Back then, silence had been heavy, full of secrets. Tonight, it was light. It was healing. I looked at my family, imperfect, mended, still standing, and felt something settle deep inside me. Last Christmas, I hadn't given them luxury gifts or grand gestures. I'd given them truth, and somehow that had been enough to save us. The stars above the ocean blurred as the wind shifted. I breathed it in. The salt, the peace, the freedom of knowing that nothing was hidden anymore. For the first time, the silence wasn't something to endure. It was something to keep. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or fury. Sometimes it walks in, quietly takes a seat at your table, and stays. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told your voice doesn't matter, remember this. The truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And that whisper can change everything. Follow our stories, stay with this space, and listen for the quiet ones. Because that's where real justice begins.